In today's We the People, it's a secret mission amidst an ongoing war. In 1943, in the midst of World War II's Italian campaign, a former Maine governor, William Tudor Gardner, takes part in a secret mission to meet with Italian generals before the Italians strike an armistice with the United States. Italian forces smuggle Gardner, then a U.S. Army colonel, into Rome, making it appear to onlookers that they are ordinary prisoners of war. Gardner confers with Italian military leaders who have lost control of much of their country to the Germans in the wake of dictator Benito Mussolini's fall from power in July. Gardner would return from the secret mission unscathed. Until tomorrow, I'm Brian Sullivan.